Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is a very special pleasure and privilege for me to welcome Larry to the 92nd Street Y. We've known each other for a long time, and I'm a big fan of his. I think he's been an extraordinary public servant. I think he did a wonderful job at Harvard, and I believe that over time people will look back and say, you know, in the late 20th century, Henry Kissinger was the guru people look to on international affairs, and years from now people will look back and say that in the early 21st century that Larry Summers was the guru people look to for understanding and enlightenment with regard to the economy, both here and internationally. So with that in mind, Larry, I think every question tonight carries an unstated preface, and that is, please help us understand. Please help us understand. And first thing is where we are in the American economy. We're into the 5th year of recovery, and yet jobs are still not coming, and growth is below normal. You've written about what you call secular stagnation. Help us understand, please, what's happening in our own economy, and then look more broadly at the international front.
David, thank you for those overly generous words, and I am very grateful for the opportunity to be back at the 92nd Street Y. It seems to me that if you see a great deal in our culture, it suggests that important public issues are discussed in terms of slogans and sound bites and bits of invective. And it seems to me the effort, to which I hope David and I will make at least a small contribution, to discuss these issues in more thoughtful and long-run kind of terms is something very, very important. And so I'm grateful to the Belfer family for supporting this program. Look, at one level, we can take satisfaction. If you look at any important economic statistic, GDP, industrial production, the stock market, world trade, they were doing worse between the fall of 2008 and the winter of 2009 than they were after the Depression started in the fall of 1929. And for all the problems, and I will talk about many of them, that we have, what's happened is nothing like what happened from 1929 onwards. And that's not an accident. That's a reflection of the strong policies that were put in place to contain the gathering storm. That said, it has to be recognized that if you look at what we thought the potential of the economy was in 2007, we have what it would be in 2014. We've made no progress since the trough of the recession in regaining that potential. If you look at the fraction of adults in the United States who are working, it's no higher than it was at the trough of the recession in 2009. And what's mostly happened is we've lowered our sights. What we think of as the potential of the economy is substantially lower than it was. Those are statistics and facts, and I don't think anybody can really argue with them. Of course, economists will debate what is the reason and what is the cause. I look at a core fact that inflation is actually lower than it was then. And so it tells me that if you have a weak economy and you have lower inflation than you did before, that your problem has more to do with demand than it does with supply. If the problem was that we didn't have any supply, then prices would be higher, not lower. And so it seems to me that what we have not been successful in doing is generating adequate demand. And if you look at why, I don't think it's so hard to figure out. Since 2010, we have been moving exactly the wrong way on public spending, exactly the wrong way on public investment. And so you look at where we are now, and it's not so easy to read. Nobody thinks we're going to have the kind of strong and robust growth that the United States has usually had after recessions this year. The optimists think that growth will run a bit above 3% this year. That's not enough to really close the existing gap with potential at a very rapid rate. And the pessimists think it's going to be worse than that. The first months of this year have been terrible. Not terrible, very weak. And the debate is that all caused by the bad weather, or does that suggest a more fundamental problem? And we don't know the answer. But I look at an economy that is substantially constrained by demand, where we have choked off public investment. And I look at the fact that I was holding my breath about whether I'd be on time here tonight, because sitting on the tarmac at LaGuardia, it took 35 minutes for there to be an empty gate into which my plane could enter. And that just didn't seem to me to be the kind of infrastructure system that the United States should have. And I say to myself, if a moment when we can borrow money at under 3% in a currency we print ourselves, and the construction unemployment rate is close to double digits, if that's not the moment to fix it, I don't know when that moment will ever come. So I think we've got a real problem of an underperforming economy, but I actually think it's not that hard. I think we just need to be prepared to use this moment to make investments rather than to stop making investments. You know, you look at any economic downturn and you look at different businesses, and the smart ones see it as an opportunity to gain market share, see it as an opportunity to pick off talented people, see it as an opportunity to make investments at a low cost. And the dumb ones think that, oh, well, we're getting less cash in, so we've got to slash everything, and who knows what will happen in the future. And as a country, we're behaving a lot more like the second group than we are like the first group. And that seems to me to be the crucial thing people have to understand. I like to talk about the infrastructure investment because I think it's the largest category and because it's the most easy to relate to, and it's the category that most closely relates to putting large numbers of the people who've seen the most unemployment to work. But it's not only infrastructure. Why shouldn't we be rushing faster to take advantage of an unprecedented opportunity to exploit newly found energy resources and make North America a net energy exporter? Why should this be the moment, of all moments, given all the things that are happening in genomics, all the things that are happening in neuroscience, why should this be the moment when we're slashing our spending on medical research? You know, when Watson and Crick found out DNA, Crick was about 32 and Watson was in his mid-20s. Today, before you get your first independent grant as a medical researcher, you're on average in your early 40s. That can't make sense from the point that, you know, Einstein was in his 20s when he discovered the theory of relativity. It just can't make sense. And yet you can see how it happens when you slash the budget and you've got a set of people who allocate the money who are older, who are used to allocating it to a set of other people, what's the most natural thing to cut off? We could talk about more examples. Why, you can argue. Reasonable people can and they should argue about how to think about inequality and the politics of redistribution versus the politics of envy, all that. But why? Why should it be that this is the moment when we've let the gap in college attendance between the children of the affluent and the children of the poor get much greater than it was in the 1970s? So there are huge, productive, positive investments we can be making that will create demand in this economy, which helps in the short run, and which also will renew us for the future. But we can't be like that business that goes, oh, cash flow's down, we're done, let's hunker down and hope for the best. And that's, alas, the strategy I think we're pursuing too much as a country.
That's very helpful. There would be people who would ask you, especially on the right, yeah, you talk about we've been moving down on government spending, but there were years, a number of years, in which the government, both through spending and borrowing and through the monetary side, was pouring enormous amounts of money into the economy, and it didn't seem to do that much good. It headed off the Depression, but it didn't seem to put us on a growth path.
So you're right that there are people who would say that. Yeah. You're right.
Well, that's an argument the president himself bought.
But they're wrong.
I mean, the president signed on to a bunch of bills doing that. Reducing the deficit.
Let's look at a couple facts and see if we can try to draw some conclusions. If you look at the sharpness of the V, from falling fast to climbing, the sharpest V that we've had in 60 years in the United States happened with the bottom of the V being June of 2009, 5 months after the stimulus was put in place. So the most superficial reading of like what caused it to turn around would be proximate to when that money was spent and when that money was committed. And the problem is that when you hit the accelerator, the car starts going fast. But if you got to go up a steep hill and you take your foot off the accelerator, then the car starts to fall back. And we did that much too soon. We let this stimulus peak in the summer of 2010, and we were still in a very deep valley. So the path was, when we hit it with stimulus, good things happened. When we stopped, bad things happened. This is not a new story. This is very interesting to look at history. Roosevelt's New Deal was a big success from 1933 to 1937. The economy grew very rapidly, grew 8 or 9% a year. And then they sort of got the idea that it was all okay and it was all normal and they could go focus on the usual things. And they cut back a variety of spending programs. They raised taxes. The central bank sought to normalize monetary conditions. And you got what, other than the Depression, is the steepest recession in US history in 1937 and 38. So the lesson is that it's like, the doctor tells you when they give you antibiotics, you got to take them for all 10 days, and if you take them for 4 and you stop, you may be worse off than you were when you started. And so we just declared victory on fiscal stimulus much too soon. Now the president, I'm mostly in agreement with what the president has said and done. I think he's right, and the conventional wisdom is right, that we've got some long-term fiscal challenges in this country. And it would be desirable to address those long-term fiscal challenges. But David, my take would be that the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that if you take the whole 75-year budget gap, if we increase the growth rate by 0.25% a year, it goes away because of the extra tax collections. That's what I'd rather be focused on doing. I'd rather be focused for the near term on accelerating the rate of growth. And I think we've had, and both parties have been complicit in this, a basically misguided debate about doing things that involve reducing deficits in 2030 or 2035. And yes, it would be better to do those things. But if you talk to businesses, that's not what they're worried about. They're worried about the fact that they won't have any orders in 2014. And that's why they're not spending. And so the trick to getting the economy going isn't primarily about entitlements or revenues in 2035. It's about driving growth for right now. Now, could you spend money badly? Of course you could spend money badly. Were there things that were non-optimal spending, could have been improved on, contained in the president's stimulus, that were driven by the priorities of somebody or other that wouldn't have been the priorities I would have chosen? Of course. But remember that one of the strongest statistical regularities, if you sort of look at economic data, it's a kind of tragic regularity in a way, but it is a regularity, is that when we fight a war, we have a boom. Because we spend a lot and it stimulates the economy. And if you think about it, tanks don't add anything to the GDP. Soldiers on the ground in Europe or Asia don't add anything to our productive potential, and yet it still produces a boom. So we could spend that money better than we spent it on in the stimulus. Of course we could, but even if it's totally unproductive in a pecuniary sense, as the military spending was, it still is beneficial economically, and it defies belief that we can't find things that are a lot more productive in terms of helping the economy's potential, sending more people to college, doing more medical research, fixing LaGuardia Airport. It defies belief that we couldn't do better than that.
Presidents as leaders are often called upon to win not only on policy but win on politics. Would your argument be that the president basically got most of the policy decisions right but lost the politics of it?
Well,
let me tell you why I say that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because there was a while, after 2 years in office, of course, the Republicans had a banner year in the off-year elections. That was in part because the Republicans were able to persuade people that the stimulus hadn't worked, and now we have a health care, and then we got a health care bill passed that was going to cost another $1 trillion in their argument, and that we were throwing money at problems without results, and that's the argument that carried them in.
I'd say a couple things. First, sometimes presidents get reelected and sometimes presidents don't. And I'd say if you have a president who got reelected successfully with an unemployment rate in the 7.5+ range, it's probably a mistake to think that he's really completely hopeless at the politics. Just lots of presidents don't get reelected, and by and large, when the unemployment rate's that high, presidents don't get reelected. So I have much more confidence that I can judge economics than that I can judge politics, but I think there's a lot of dismissing the president as a political figure that doesn't seem to me to be warranted. That's the first thing I'd say. I think there's no question that the implementation so far of the health insurance bill has been a hopeless botch. I mean, it really could have been done much better, and I think everyone who's in the administration can legitimately be faulted for not having put more effort into it, for not having had the process of building websites and designing exchanges and all of that much more insulated from politics and PR than it was. And I don't minimize that as an error, and I think the president has not minimized that as an error. That said, I would say that in judging it, one has to judge two other things. And I don't know that they will completely make it okay, but I think you do have to recognize them. One is that Social Security didn't look so great in its first 18 months of being in a play. You know, where are the checks, and how are we collecting the taxes, and can we really bookkeep all this? There were a bunch of problems. Medicare, the doctors thought was creeping socialism that was going to bring our healthcare system to an end. Prescription drugs looked like a failure after the first 12 months. And so you got to see how this all shakes out. And I'm not certain that it's going to shake out well, but I just think it's a mistake not to recognize that you can't judge something by the first weeks of its introduction. The second thing is that sometimes, and I think this is a growing problem that we have in our politics, because of the power of conservative voices, and to some extent because others respond to those voices, we try to do things in ways that represent as little change as possible. And therefore we end up with rather kludgy and incremental changes. I mean, if you take and I've had a little experience with the information technology area. When I was at Treasury, we had to oversee the fact that the IRS computer technology things were a complete mess. And the evidence is that it's often much easier to build a new one than it is to keep an old one and just make incremental repairs.
Information technology.
In a lot of different, in an information technology system, but I would argue more broadly in a healthcare system. The fact that we had to design it in a way that absolutely minimized the number of people whose experience was changed made it a much more complex implementation problem.
So the politics of it forced you to do that.
Than it might have been, and that was something that was forced on us by the politics. And so, you know, what do you do in that circumstance? I think that is, I think in the domestic policy area, that's going to be the central thing that's going to affect history's judgment of this president. If, as would be my best guess, in 2025, this will seem like Medicare did in 1980, how could you really imagine America without some kind of universal health care? How could you imagine America as a place where if you were sick, you couldn't get health insurance?
Yeah.
And if that happens, nobody's going to remember the website and the 6 million and all that stuff. And the president's going to be thought of as the person who presided over preventing a depression and who passed the most substantial progressive legislation in a half century. I think if it all is still not working badly and the political winds blow against him and the whole thing is repealed or substantially eviscerated and it becomes inconceivable that America will ever pass universal health insurance as a consequence of this failure, then I think history will judge this president in a much less generous way. I don't think you can know which it's going to be. I think it will depend very importantly on what happens with health care over the next 3 years and then what happens in the 2016 presidential elections. My reasonably confident, but no more than reasonably confident bet would be that it will work out in the more positive direction.
Well, the one difference between Medicare and the Affordable Care Act was that Lyndon Johnson got a supermajority to pass Medicare. There were a lot of Republicans who bought into it at the time, and this one had no Republicans. Politics changed. It was just very difficult. That's Pat Moynihan's argument about a lot of social milestones and legislation. It takes, if you get a supermajority, it changes the politics after it's over. So you don't have.
Here's what, if I were a sort of political scientist historian, I might be working on, and David, you would in some ways know much more about this than I. People often make exactly your argument that, you know, anything to be successful and to really work has to be bipartisan in the United States. And if it's not bipartisan, somehow it's not on the up and up quite, and all that. And I guess my question about that would be, hasn't our system profoundly changed? That in Lyndon Johnson's day, you had a lot of people who were in the Jacob Javits tradition, and you had a lot of people who were in the John Stennis tradition. And so you had all kinds of Republicans who on any regular measure were well to the left of all kinds of Democrats. So when you had a coalition of the left, it had both Democrats and Republicans in it. Yeah. And now our parties have sorted themselves out. And by the way, political scientists were saying this was what should happen. If you read what James McGregor Burns was saying in the 1960s, he was saying the real problem with American politics was that we don't have disciplined, unified parties.
Sometimes political scientists get it wrong too.
That present choices. But exactly. But I guess the question would be, maybe the right way to think about it is it's all about bipartisan Democrat, Republican. Or maybe the right way to think about it is we've always had coalitions of the left do left things and coalitions of the right do right things. And it's just that the left is differently organized into parties and the right is differently organized into parties than before. I was there. I was there on a few things. The president wanted this to be bipartisan. He really did prefer for it to be bipartisan. But it takes two to dance. I mean, and there just was, in the end of the day, no will. I'll give you an example where I personally probably am not especially committed to the traditional Democratic position. Malpractice reform and major malpractice reform as an element of the health insurance bill. That's a thing where heavily, because of the funding of the trial lawyers, the Democrats have always opposed it, and Republicans have been much more open and supportive of malpractice reform. The president would have, at considerable political cost to himself, I think probably would have given that one up. But he wouldn't give that one up unless he was going to get some Republican votes. And it was clear that he was prepared to give it up for Republican votes, but at the end of the day, there were no Republican votes, even if he did give that up. And I think that there was, you know, it tells you something. It tells you something that the majority leader, I guess he was the minority leader at the time, of the Senate, 2 weeks in, when he was asked, what's your agenda for the next 2 years, didn't talk about the Depression, didn't talk about his theory of health reform, didn't talk about fixing a broken financial regulatory system. He said, my agenda for the next 2 years is to do everything I can to make this president not be reelected. Well, you know, at a certain point, it makes compromise kind of difficult. And so I think you got to be careful in judging these things. But I think, in a sense, David, we'll know the answer 6 or 8 years from now when we see what happens with healthcare. If healthcare is eviscerated, then I think the Moynihan kind of argument that you shouldn't do things and it shouldn't have been done if it wasn't going to be bipartisan, it's going to look a lot better. And if we have it and it's working and everybody's used to it, and just like Ronald Reagan made his peace with Medicare, Republicans are making their peace with this, then I think people are really going to say that the president showed extraordinary courage and perseverance in moving ahead with it.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add this on your to bolster your point. I've been to 2 gatherings of major healthcare figures, CEOs of hospitals and others who are, and almost to a person, they are pretty optimistic about where this is going to go. They think it's here to stay. It will be modified in various ways, but that there's a lot of effort now underway, and especially among hospitals, to bring costs down. One CEO of a major hospital told me he spent 50% of his time now on mergers and acquisitions. They're all trying to figure out how to get bigger and get more efficient. And doctors are going to increasingly be working for these large mega organizations.
I think that's right. And I also think that maybe luck is the residue of design, or as Vince Lombardi said, you make your breaks. I can't give you an argument that traces it to a set of provisions in Obamacare. I cannot draw the causal links in a strong and direct way. But it is a fact that in terms of the containment of healthcare costs, we've had the best performance in the last 3 years that the United States has had since the Second World War. And it is a fact that while everybody says Washington has been gridlocked and all of that, and there's obviously much to that, that $1 trillion, which is still a fair amount of money, has come out of the CBO's 10-year budget forecast for where healthcare is going. So I guess there's a deeper point, maybe, David, that we should say. There's a lot to be worried about. But, it's been gridlock and it's been terrible. But, if you said what were fundamental issues facing the country, you would have said growth of healthcare costs. And somehow that one's in a very different place than it was a few years ago. You would have said that energy independence, that energy dependence on the Middle East was a very fundamental one. That's a very different one. That's in a very different place than it was 5 or 6 years ago. You would have said that questions around rights and diversity and all of that, and if you think about where we are as a country on gay marriage, if you think about where we are as a country on race, we've got a long way to go on all kinds of issues of inclusion, but we're in a much better place than we were 6 years ago. And so I think that one needs also to recognize in thinking about the United States that there's a kind of profound resilience in our system and our flexibility where not everything needs to come out of Washington, where somehow problems get solved without big laws sometimes, and that can be a very positive thing. I think that's something that people on my side tend to neglect. They tend to think we're either passing heroic laws or the country is stagnating. I don't think that's really right. And I think there's a lot to worry about. but there's also quite a bit that's positive that's happening.
Well, there's so many different responses to that, and time is short. So let me move on. You were writing before you went in to the Obama administration about your concerns about growing inequality, and you've continued to emphasize that since. There's a new mayor here in New York who is obviously dedicated to that proposition. As you look at his approach, as you think about how we should be solving inequality, what counsel?
I think you got to look at the way many people live and the way many other people live and relate to the view that there are two Americas. I think you got to look at statistics. Basically, the statistics are that the top 1% used to get 8 or 9% of the income. Now they get 23% of the income, so it's gone up by about 15%. Nothing's happened to the 80 to 99, and the bottom 80% have lost 15% of the total income, which is more than $10,000 for the average family in that group. And I don't see how you can say that issues of inequality are unimportant in thinking about the American economy. You look at the fact that all of the gains in life expectancy in this country over the last 30 years have come in the top half of the income distribution on socioeconomic status. You look at the fact that the gap in the racial gap between black and white kids in educational achievement has fallen in half. So things can happen when we put our attention to them. But that the gap between rich and poor kids has widened very substantially. You can't not be focused on this. But the question, I think, is how do you focus on it? And I think that there's an enormous temptation to a politics of envy. A politics that says that the way we want to achieve more fairness is to tear down the people at the top. That just thinks their having less is kind of an act of good unto itself, even if it doesn't translate into more for anybody else. And I think that's a mistaken politics. I think it's a mistaken politics because a great deal of their wealth pursuit benefits lots of people in the economy. You can't have employees without having employers. I think it's a mistake because it's not where the values of the American people were. I mean, to me, in some ways, the most revealing political anecdote of my adult lifetime came very early in my adult lifetime when George McGovern went to a United Auto Workers convention, and he proposed essentially confiscatory estate taxation on estates that would today be more than $75 million. And they booed him off the stage. And they booed him off the stage. And that's because it's the dream. It's, if I can't do it, my kids can, and that's the dream, and that is part of what propels America. So focusing on leveling down the most able is not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is a few principles. Inclusive prosperity. You got to make sure that when there's success, everybody has a chance to share in it. Opportunity. That's why of all the things I had a chance to work on during my time as president of Harvard, the one I'm proudest of is establishing the principle that no one with a family income under $60,000 would have to pay a penny to come to Harvard because of the signal it would send. The principle of shared sacrifice and contribution. why should it be that the richest people pay the lowest tax rates? Why should it be that when you measure when you measure corporate profits in America as they're reported on corporations' tax returns, you would think that the most corporate profits would be earned in the biggest economies, places like China, places like Japan, France, Britain, whatever. You would be wrong. The places that show up with the most profits are the Netherlands and Ireland, and if anybody hasn't figured it out, the Cayman Islands. And it just shouldn't be that way. And it can be corrected. And I think the other thing, and this is both a public sector issue and a private sector issue, is a politics of more accountability than we've had. If you create something fantastic, if you do something extraordinarily clever, if you recognize opportunity in some asset where no one else saw opportunity and you buy it, I don't think we should begrudge you getting pretty rich. If you run a company into the ground, then I do begrudge you getting rich. If you break the law in order to succeed, then we do begrudge you getting rich. And I think if we can focus on accountability, can focus on where money needs to be raised, raising it in fair ways, can focus on a much greater effort to provide opportunity, and can focus on doing things that will employ everybody and give everybody a chance to succeed, which, by the way, goes back to doing things like fixing Kennedy and LaGuardia airports, then I think we will be in a position to really be addressing fairness, but to be doing it without the focus being on envy, which I don't think is a strategy that's going to fully work.
Very thoughtful. Question from the audience. Rapid increases in cost of college. Do you see that trend continuing or coming toward an end, especially with new technologies?
I wish I could be more optimistic. A fair amount of it for the population as a whole really is a reflection of the fact that state and local governments have their budgets strapped, and therefore they can't contribute as much money, and therefore state universities and state colleges have to jack the tuition up. So it's not really about the higher education activity, it's about the pressure on state and local budgets. I don't think that's going to change unless we get the economy growing substantially more rapidly. Here's a fact that nobody knows, and when I first heard it, I didn't believe it, but it actually is true. If you look at the Ivy League, and it's a special group of colleges that applies only to a small number of people, but it's not completely without significance, David, and if you look at not tuition, but tuition paid, over the last 15 years, it's grown considerably more slowly than the CPI.
Really?
Because financial aid has been very substantially increased, and I'm not sure that I want to make bringing the price of college down for my kids or Bill Gates' kids, not that they're in remotely the same place, a particularly high national priority. And so the notion of more tuition for the minority that can afford to pay it and more financial aid, I actually think that's a kind of strategy that works in the right direction. I do think that we're going to see some significant economies realized through the use of internet-based approaches to education in the next decade. I think, and I don't think this has really been exploited yet to the extent that it will be, that the remarkable thing about what the internet and what so-called MOOCs, massive online open courses, have the potential to do is they, on the one hand, greatly raise the scale, because, you know, my wife is doing a wonderful course on poetry, and there are 15,000 students who are registered to take that course. Well, you can't get 15,000 students into a classroom anywhere. So on the one hand, there's the capacity for massive increases in scale. And on the other hand, along with it, and this is what hasn't been fully exploited yet, there's the opportunity for much more individualization. You found some parts of the lecture easy, you can listen to them fast. Some parts were confusing to you, you can hear it 4 times. You're teaching math, you can give everybody a few problems, and you know, the kids who are having trouble with addition, they get more addition problems. The kids who are having trouble with subtraction, they get more subtraction problems. The kids for whom it's really easy, they get hard problems. The kids for whom it's really tough, they get more review problems. You're particularly interested in that poetry course in learning more about Dickinson. There's supplemental materials that you can go into more depth on Dickinson, and somebody else can go into more depth on Longfellow. So at its best, it can be both. And if we succeed in devising that, I think this could be quite transformative for higher education, but it's not going to be easy. You know, maybe here's a way to think about it. I've read and been told, it's not like I was there or really know, that the first movies and the first talking movies were basically people would put on a play and somebody would put a camera in the back of the room. And eventually people figured out that that was really kind of a bad way to make a movie, and that the camera created a lot of technology that did things that made it a different medium with different people who were good at it than was the case with theater. And I think the transformation that is going to happen, and you know, something I've learned about watching what my wife's trying to do is she travels around to do her poetry course. The transformation's going to come when it's not a camera in the back of a classroom, but is a different kind of experience that is synthesized and curated, and that's going to take a while, but it will come.
Some investment up front, but more over time.
I think it's going to take a very substantial investment up front. You know, I was just reflecting on the fact that if you ask any college president in the United States, they will tell you that tuition covers a third or a half or some fraction like that of the cost of educating a student. Well, if we really want to maximize this technology, some people are going to have to step up and make very large investments in it. And while I'm excited about the things that are happening, I'm not sure that we've quite, as a country, gotten ourselves to figuring out to make the kind of massive investment that full success is going to really require.
Mm-hmm. A couple of international questions. How concerned are you about what some would call an isolationist trend on fast-track authority for the President of Defense, IMF, related issues?
I've sounded like I was concerned about a lot of things, so I don't know how to calibrate it exactly. But here's what I think. I think it is dangerous and potentially unstable world. That everything we know about history, everything we know about neighborhoods suggests that anarchy without any sense of leadership sooner or later ends in chaos and pain. That, it seems to me, is a very basic lesson of several thousand years of history, and it's a lesson of the human experience on a smaller scale. And it has fallen to the United States to be an agenda setter, shaper, and underwriter of the global system. Because of what happened after the Second World War, because we're protected by two oceans, because we've been remarkable at creating prosperity, because the values associated with our democratic system are more inspirational to others than other values. That has fallen to the United States. And what I worry about is whether this generation has the will for the job. It's got the capacity. We've got immense capacity to do whatever we want to do. Remember, what's holding back our economy is not the lack of capacity to produce things, but is the lack of demand. But I look at trade and keeping the system open. And right now, you won't find anybody who's confident that we're going to be able to move forward on trade in our political process. You'll find people who are negatively confident, and you'll find people who think it could go either way, but you won't find anybody who's confident. You look at participation in international organizations. Here it is. We're going to have to underwrite the financing of Ukraine. Here it is. There are emerging markets becoming increasingly unstable. And we can't, in the United States, vote to support the IMF, which hasn't lost a penny in 60 years. It isn't going to cost us a penny because people have various ideological objections. You know, nobody had Ukraine as a major national security issue on the horizon 8 weeks ago. In a world like that, can it possibly make sense for us to cut our armed forces back to the lowest level that they had since 1940? I don't really think that it does. You know, one of the books that I read, because I heard something about it and it was different than I had thought, that made a real impression on me in the last few months, was John Kennedy's book that was actually his undergraduate thesis at Harvard, called Why England Slept. And what I thought, and what I had thought, and what I would guess most people in this room think, is that Neville Chamberlain made a terrible mistake at Munich with his appeasement strategy, and that emboldened Hitler, and then Hitler moved on, and then we had the Second World War. And I actually thought that's what Kennedy's book said, Why England Slept. It seemed like that's what it would say. It's actually not what it says at all. What it actually argues, I'm not a professional historian, but the arguments seem persuasive. What it actually argues is that Chamberlain had no choice at Munich, that Britain had no force with which to confront Hitler, and so he really didn't have another option except to sort of play for time and hope that this would work out, and he took the only choice he had. And that the real error was the one that Churchill had been warning about from 1935 on, which was the failure to be prepared in a dangerous world. Now, I don't see anything on the world system right now that remotely resembles the threat that Hitler posed. But just because we have greater national security needs in Asia doesn't make me think we have less national security needs than we did before in the Middle East. And we're now seeing that where we thought security was last century's problem, in Europe, it's not completely clear that will always be so. And so I think whether you look at military, you look at participation in international institutions, you look at trade, you look at soft power kinds of things. There's another sort of shocking fact, at least shocking to me. People who are expert on this will tell you that the chance of a pandemic, big flu, like we had in 1919, the pessimists think it's 1.5% a year. The optimists think it's 0.5% a year. But it's like a real possibility, and it'll be much worse now than it was in 1919 because people fly across continents and there's much more transmission. The global community's effort on that is focused at the WHO, World Health Organization, and its budget is half that of, for the flu, is half that of New York City. And that's about what the international system does in terms of funding international efforts. Take global climate change. That's another example. Where are we? We're roughly nowhere in terms of what kind of leadership. We provide great rhetorical leadership. Our guys give the best speeches, and our scientists do the best studies. But if you ask, like, what are we actually doing to reduce carbon emissions? I mean, we've been lucky. Unlucky. We had a recession, and that had the consequence that carbon emissions were reduced. And we've been lucky that we discovered a lot of natural gas, and so that natural gas is reducing carbon emissions. But if you say, what have we done because the planet is melting? First approximation, the answer is nothing. And so I look at it across the board, and I see us stepped back. Now, I don't think the United States has to be exceptional. I don't think that, we've got some kind of white man's burden. But I look and I say, if we're stepped back, where is something going to happen that's going to avoid chaos and anarchy? The European Union seems to have enough trouble making its own money work to do all of that. Japan is getting older, and has a shrinking population and sold more old age diapers than it did baby diapers last year.
Yeah.
China, I don't think China is ready to take on global responsibility in the kind of spirit that the United States has traditionally. So I think it's a huge thing for all of us.
Larry, your comments about the international scene, which is very sobering, remind me that you and I both have flights from JFK Airport tonight. It's starting at about an hour and a half. And I think if we're going to go to a third world airport, we probably ought to get started. So I'm going to draw this to a close, but I want to ask all of you, first of all, thank you, Larry, so much for being here, but I want to ask all of you to join in thanking the Belfer family and also thanking Larry Summers for an extraordinary evening. I thought you were going to get it. Thank you. Let's go.